Hello, Igor.
Hello, Henry. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. Yesterday, I had a bit of an odd experience. I was in a fish restaurant, and the people who were sitting at the table next to mine ordered a lobster. I was impressed by how beautiful the dish looked. The red lobster with the green garnish and the yellow lemons. It really put me in a cheerful mood. It was quite earnest and naive as a picture of a lobster. It was exactly what one would expect from a lobster dinner.
Yes,
Pretty
it
good.
looks it looks very appetizing. The food is so bright, it really gives you a cheerful feeling. The dish must have been created for special celebrations.
When I looked at the price of such a dish, thinking, of course, I might nab one for myself, I considered it rather pricey, not to be bought without need for celebration. The average price of a 600-gram lobster in a restaurant, I was surprised to find, is 45 euros. It makes sense why it is served so formally and safely, all in all, Igor.
I suppose, yes. And by the way, do you remember the fantastic film called Mrs. Doubtfire? There is a part where
Mhm.
Mrs. Doubtfire, aka Daniel, cooks lobsters.
I do remember both the film and the part you're talking about now that I take a moment to collect myself. Yes, I remember.
What a real pleasure it is to sit and look at the lobsters. Do you think you would like to see some more of these wonderful creatures? Here's the snag, Henry. No offense to the lobsters, but you can't actually call them attractive, can you? That's a live lobster on a seashore.
No, not exactly cuddly, nor exactly welcoming. A handshake from a lobster is one thing most certainly to be spurned as well. The appearance, all in all, is rather unappealing. I would have never plucked up the courage to taste anything like that were it unknown to me. I
Yeah.
wonder how someone did eventually come up with the idea of eating such a thing.
And looking at this photo, I can only guess that the person who was the first to decide to eat a lobster must have been really hungry. No, forget that. He was starving, even dying of starvation. I myself could never eat a live lobster, but I would certainly be plucky enough to take one in my hands and cuddle it.
Yes, I'd say cuddling is the safer one. Wouldn't want to kiss a crustacean. I think that's a very good way to get an interesting parthenon of diseases. It's the same thing with certain types of lizard. They're completely edible and rather tasty once cooked.
Oh no, please
Raw,
don't.
it's a very good way to get salmonella. So you don't do that when it's raw because the salmonella lives on their skin. I don't know what lives on the shell of a lobster, but I'm sure it's a pretty interesting collection of biomes. So, looking at this photo, I have no doubt that hunger was certainly the strongest argument to start using lobsters as food.
Yeah. Just
Hmm.
imagine a hungry person walks along the beach, sees this beast, stops in wonder and says aloud, Eureka! Why don't I try it as food? Then, to his great surprise, the big burly lobster overhears it and faints.
Recently, I read a book called Consider the Lobster by David Foster Wallace. The author mentions that lobsters were eaten in huge amounts by the settlers of the first English colonies in New England in the 17th century.
When the English settlers first came to New England, they quickly learned that the locals depended very heavily on lobster as a source of protein. After storms, lobsters would wash up on shore by the hundreds, by the millions, by the thousands. And if you were quick enough, you could pick them up, cook them up, be pinched a bit, and eat them up before they had the chance to spoil.
So the first few years for the settlers were extremely difficult all in all, and the abundance of lobsters from time to time when they were washed up probably became the crustaceans' undoing in the settlers' eyes eventually. They would have eaten lobster almost constantly when was available, and the odor of thousands of dead lobsters on a beach, neglected because there are limits to what people can consume, would have made them consider the lobster to be a rather low quality food.
Indeed. And in
Mm.
1622, the governor of Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford, was really embarrassed to admit to newly arrived colonists that the only food they could present their friends with It was a lobster, without bread or anything else but a cup of fair water.
I imagine if you polled people's opinions about lobsters, they would probably rank them equal with cockroaches, Igor.
I suppose so. And you really are a telepath because
Really?
lobsters were even referred to in a dismissive way as cockroaches of the ocean, or
Hmm.
sometimes sea bugs. They belong to the crustacean family, and they are much bigger than cockroaches. And they have many legs. They were thought of as sea spiders. Even the
Hmm.
word lobster itself stems from the Old English lope, meaning spider.
Hmm. Okay, well, fair enough, I suppose. I mean, lobster was considered food unworthy of being on the dining tables of the rich and respectable. The lobster we now know as an expensive luxury dish was in the past considered food for the poor and was served to people of lower social classes and castes. Hmm.
Indeed, it was.
Hmm.
It was served to slaves, servants, beggars, soldiers, and even prisoners. It is said that in the 17th century, some of the Massachusetts colonists revolted, and the colony was forced to sign contracts promising that indentured servants wouldn't be fed lobster meals more than 3 times a week.
Yes, quite fair, to be honest. Comparatively, in the annals of Lunenburg Prison in Nova Scotia in Canada, there's a similar document. It instead depicts a rebellion of prisoners, and these prisoners were angered by being fed lobster every single day.
Yes, according to the prisoners, the constant lobster dinners constituted cruel and unusual punishment.
Hmm.
And today, Henry, can you imagine lobster in the chowder prisoners eat? Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it?
To tell you the truth, Igor, prisoners, I imagine, had their reasons for disliking the lobster being supplied. I mean, the lobster they ate had most likely been dead for several days before it was boiled, so not exactly the most sanitary nor reliable of foods. And in this case, lots of harmful bacteria almost certainly developed inside the lobster.
Yes, and apart from that, when a dead lobster is kept, protein decomposing enzymes and probably even flesh eating bacteria start working, which
Mm,
makes lobster meat unsuitable for eating, or at least you can eat practically anything, but
mm.
it would be very unpleasant.
Yes, I mean, technically one can boil their shoes and eat those when desperate, but
Yes.
it's not something someone does for fun. No one really goes to a shoe restaurant. It was practically impossible to deliver these creatures from coastal fishing villages inland in a way that made them consumable, at least. The lobsters would die pretty quickly, and then they would go off pretty quickly. Rather sad, to be honest.
And so it was the lot of the poor locals of seaside settlements to suffer from the everyday monotony of their diet. Lobster for breakfast, for lunch, and for maybe for tea, and maybe for dinner. Interesting. What will I have? Think.
Mm.
Lobster?
Yes, what?
Lobster? Or lobster?
And as time went on, lobster was identified as a subsistence food, as a last resort, something only to be eaten out of desperation.
Lobster shows about a house, looked upon as signs of poverty and degradation, wrote John J. Rowan in 1876.
Hmm. I mean, surely people were sick and tired of them at that point.
They were literally fed up with them, and they dreamed of pies and salads, pasta and puddings.
Lobsters were in such abundance that they were fed to pigs and goats and used as bait for fishing from time to time.
Their shells
Uh,
were ground to powder, and the powder was even used as fertilizer for their kitchen garden. And actually, during my travels, I once visited an old pharmacy where I saw
hmm.
medicine made of lobster shell powder. In the past, this medicine was used to treat kidney stones. However, I doubt it helped, but really, anything's possible.
It would be interesting to think of lobsters not as food but as animals for a moment. I mean, Igor, let's test our knowledge on lobsters. Do you know taxonomy and the systematization of lobsters? I bet you don't.
Really, do you? Henry,
Mm-hmm.
you're doubting a professor of biology who is
Ah,
14 years old and who has dedicated his whole 14-year-old life to biology.
well, wonderful. So let's have a look at the professional knowledge then. The phylum,
Arthropoda,
subphylum,
Crustacea,
the class,
Malacostraca,
the order,
Decapoda,
the family.
Nephropodi.
Hmm, sounds pretty happy all in all.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
As the lobster grows, it needs to shed the shell it has grown out of. During their first year of life, lobsters grow very quickly indeed, and so shed very often. By the time the lobster is 7 years old, they shed only once a year, and then once every 2 to 3 years. And the growth is limited by each phase of shedding, so as you can imagine, the rate of growth declines pretty quickly. Fishing villages are places where lobsters are pretty easily caught, especially during low tides. The majority of them were caught with hands and plucked right from the sea, in the early days at least, where they were so abundant, trapping them was essentially pointless. Over time, though, this did change.
And in the 19th century, lobster traps were invented. The traps haven't changed since then. That's what a trap looks like. It is made of wood and rope netting. Some fish is put inside the trap as a bait. After that, the trap is submerged and put on the bottom of the sea.
These are paintings depicting this process. In fishing villages, as we've already mentioned, lobster gathering was a family business. People involved in such business needed a boat and several lobster traps.
And it was the job of men to prepare traps, the job of women and children to make traps. And in the evening, the man just lobbed the traps into the water, and early in the morning, they took what they had caught to the market. And look, here is a submerged trap, and a lobster contemplating beside it. A crucial moment which will define its future. To be or not to be. Rather, to bite or not to bite. Think well, lobster. Use your grey cells. Use your loaf.
Can you see the two lobsters on the table in this particular painting?
I sure can. This is one more fishmonger's stand with a huge black lobster on it. And even crabs are sold there, not speaking even about mussels, fish, lampreys. Well, speaking of the changes in the life of lobsters, by the 19th century, the lobster had lost its former status as the food for the poor and had become status food. What caused such great changes? Henry, two heads are better than one, so why not put our heads together and trying not to bonk them, because that would be quite hurtful and painful, and solve the mystery.
I think this, as with other changes, there are numbers of factors that intermingle and lead to multiple causes to cause something like this to shift in such a drastic way. First, the situation started to change when railways appeared, so that could be seen as the moment of galvanized change. When the railways started to spread through America, transportation managers realized something pretty interesting. If no one knew what lobster was, trains could serve it to passengers as if it were a rare exotic item, and even though it was very cheap for those running the railroad to procure it, people would swallow it as being a particularly prestigious dish.
Inland passengers were intrigued. Lobster was delicious. Passengers who were ignorantly blind of the fact that lobster was considered trash food on the coast started to love it and it became a popular food. Secondly, refrigerators were invented in the second half of the 19th century. In this way, live lobsters could be delivered to far places.
And another important factor to do with the technological progress and contributing factors to the lobster's spread inland was the expansion of tin food production. And it turned out once lobster was cooked, it was pretty easy to can. So in the mid 1800s, people as far away as California were able to buy and eat Maine lobster for the very first time.
By the 1880s, chefs had discovered that lobster was a lot better and looked a lot more appetizing if they cooked it alive than if they killed it first and cooked it later. Restaurants first started to serve lobster in the 1850s and 60s in the salad section, such as bread, butter, pickles, or cottage cheese.
Chilled lobster got into the menus of the dining cars in the United States, and especially in those American states that had no access to the ocean. There, people had no idea about the lobster being food for the poor, so as a consequence, no preconceptions to get in the way of a tidy sale and a rather neat profit.
If you could, Henry, would you be willing to be teleported there into the dining car?
I'd be happy to sit there and have dinner there.
Well, chefs started experimenting with lobster and came up with a great number of new dishes. People developed a taste for lobster. There was a surge in demand for lobster dishes. On this restaurant menu, we can see at least 2 dishes that contain lobster. One of the dishes is made of lobster, sauterne, cream, shallots, and mushrooms. The second one is broiled New Zealand lobster tail.
Lobsters were boiled, stuffed, fried, stewed, and put into soup. They were accompanied by cheese and pineapples from time to time, mushrooms, as well as vegetables, foie gras, and sauces made of cream, mango, artichokes, and white wine. The whole kit and caboodle.
Henry, do you know the name of a now famous lobster dish invented in France?
Maybe, but lobster in wine, homard dans les vie, perhaps.
Okay, no, that's too easy.
Really? Oh, okay. Here's a more difficult one, perhaps. Lobster with champignon, de homard au champignon, perhaps.
Frankly speaking, it's impossible to guess. The dish is called thermidor.
Oh, right. It was first served on January 24th, 1891 in Chez Marie, a restaurant in Paris. The dish got its name after a play by Victorien Sadot, which was premiered on that day.
Can you imagine how excited businessmen were? They rushed into buying lobsters from fishermen, or lobstermen, should I say. It was a proper gold mine, gold right under their feet.
Most definitely. And entrepreneurs in general do love it when they have a gold mine. They started netting considerable dividends, and one generation of lobster businessmen got so very, very rich, they even had a chance to build houses for themselves when suddenly there were numerous complaints from fishermen about the decrease in lobster catch. Then this boom became a little less certain.
Just as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. Why did that happen?
Well, Igor, I mean, I want to recite another saying as my answer to your question. Don't bite the hand that feeds you, and that's when another factor shows itself. As a result of increased consumption, lobster populations were practically exhausted by the middle of the 20th century. They became quite rare.
And do you know why? It turns out lobsters grow very, very slowly. In this photo, we see lobsters that seem ordinary, or even on the small side. They weigh about 1.25 pounds, or just half a kilo. That means that they are definitely more than 14 years old. Just imagine how long it took for one individual to grow. That's why there are no lobster farms. It makes no economic sense whatsoever.
Yes, unfortunately. So when the lobster catch significantly decreased, the natural law of social psychology came through. The less available the product is, the more attractive it seems to other people. And Igor, remember when the shores were strewn with lobsters and they were considered food unworthy of the higher social classes and castes?
Yeah, indeed. And when they
Mm-hmm.
became scarce, the rich people decided to emphasize their high social status by consuming lobsters, or should I say cockroaches? I mean, such hypocrisy. I mean, really, such hypocrisy. First, lobsters were abundant and they didn't want to eat them at all. And when lobsters became scarce, they just started crying their heads off.
Quite a shock. I mean, it's almost like with gourmet food, the flavor is not the most important part. Lobster was sold to European aristocrats and became one of the most expensive seafood products in general. Um, yes, surprising how these things come around.
Yes, indeed. The food that earlier had been eaten and even resented by the poor and the fishermen turned into an attribute of elite. Quite the social climber the lobster is.